Okay, welcome to part 3. I think this might be our final part for the lecture on nonverbal messaging. So we just got finished going over the list of tells and what we look for: immediacy, responsiveness, and the power and dominance cues. So let's talk a little bit more about what we look for when it comes to nonverbal messaging. The first one is that we look for the context in which the nonverbal messaging is happening, because that will dictate very easily for us what that typically means when it comes to nonverbal behavior. Remember at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about everything happens within a context, culture, and environment, right? Context is a very big indicator of what's going on around us, communication, uh, rules, and culturally driven ways in which we have interpersonal communication. So just like for verbal messaging, context is just as important for nonverbal messaging. We also look for these clusters of nonverbal messaging that helps us put together the pieces. So when there's a lot of nonverbal messaging happening in one situation, right, we kind of gather them together and place them together as kind of pieces to a puzzle that help us figure out further messaging, whether it be big picture, whether it helps us dictate the context of the situation, or helps us piece together parts of the relationship or the communication style that's happening that helps us kind of governs the situation or helps us figure out what's going on with the messaging. Also, past experience is absolutely important when it comes to nonverbal messaging, because the more we can pull from the past, the more that we know about somebody, the more that we've interacted with somebody, the more that we've asked clarifying questions or seen somebody give a response a certain way nonverbally and understand its context, that actually can be pulled forward into current day communication, right? And helps us understand that, maybe nonverbal behavior is somebody's personality. Maybe it's truthful how they react. Maybe they're not nonverbal messaging people, right? And some people can take that as offensive. Some people might have a hard time understanding that. Or some people might see it as, a benefit in somebody's relationship. Somebody might see it as not a benefit, right? But the more we know from the past, the better we are at accurately understanding nonverbal messaging. Also, we have this idea of expectation versus observation. And when we talked about perception, we talked about expectations, right? And that a lot of times somebody's failure to meet your expectations are actually expectations that are put on by you, right? So you place the expectation on somebody, they fail to meet it. Your perception of the situation is dictated by that failure to meet an expectation. In nonverbal messaging, that is the same as well, right? There's an expectation that you're going to act a certain way in a situation. Those expectations might not actually be what you observe in a situation. So when you are reading nonverbal messaging or understanding nonverbal messaging that is being given out by somebody else, you have to think about what your expectations are for the nonverbal messaging and what you're observing. And if they align, great. And if they don't, you have to start thinking about why they don't, right? Is it context of the situation? Is it the expectation that you either are fairly or unfairly putting on the situation or the person? And then what are you actually observing, right? And how that goes against or goes with what you have decided should happen. So in this expectation versus observation, there is something called an expectancy violation theory. And that is the idea that in nonverbal messaging, we actually base others' nonverbal messaging on what we expect from them. And when they violate that, we tend to judge people more harshly than we would if they met our expectations. So if you have a situation where you walk in and maybe you are telling a funny joke, right? And you expect the room to laugh, and somebody doesn't laugh, and you actually think they're kind of rude, right? And so you would walk away being like, that person was incredibly rude. Like, I said something funny and I expected them to laugh. Well, first of all, you place that expectation on somebody, right? So their failure there is meeting your expectation that you set. So there's that first, right? And it's not to say that you shouldn't have expectations for people, but just remember that the expectations root in you, right? It's not the behavior that is expected, or that is, there's not a rule book, right, for how people would react. We know we're all different. The expectations for how people act are set on that. So in expectancy violation theory, when you observe something that doesn't match with what you expect them to, how you expect them to act, you actually judge their behavior based on that. So the messaging, becomes part of their personality, and their nonverbal skills become who you think they are as a person when they violate, quote unquote, violate this expectation that you have of how somebody should communicate. So expectancy violation theory is that area, relates to expectation versus observation. The last one is perception check, and that is closely related to what we're talking about, because remember, we all perceive messages differently. Our perception is colored by our own life experiences. So, when people say like you're letting this judgment of something else cloud your expectations of something, or how you view the world, whatever it may be, your perception of something absolutely matters when it comes to nonverbal communication. So and that's part of the reason why we talk about perception early on in the semester, because it's so influential to the rest of interpersonal communication and interpersonal relationships. In nonverbal messaging, your perception, your lived experiences that influence that perception are absolutely going to influence how you understand nonverbal messaging. So why we say perception check is, a lot of times really good self-awareness is you taking a step back and saying, okay, let me check my perception in this area. What actually happened? What was my expectation? Is it somebody not communicating well? Is it somebody not being their authentic self? Like, what is actually going on here? It's kind of, in a way, taking a step back and checking, am I perceiving this information correctly? The answer might be yes, right? This isn't a perception check to change your perception of it, because your answers might be like yes, 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 right? The perception checks are correct. But keep in mind that you want to just take a step back and think, okay, remember, I am viewing this situation through the rosy colored lens of the perception glasses that I'm wearing. Then they're mine alone, because they're my own lived experience. So I have to make sure that I am accurately interpreting these nonverbal messages and not letting them kind of be clouded by something else. In class, I usually tell the story about when I first met my now husband. He was an incredibly, still is, very dry, sarcastic sense of humor. And it was something that I thought immediately was hilarious. I still do to this day. It's one of his best qualities. But I actually hadn't interacted with somebody that was that dry sense of humor very often. So when I first started getting to know him, before we, had started a relationship, and I kind of knew him as a friend of a friend, I had a really kind of hard time reading him, understanding what was funny and what wasn't, and I was sometimes confused by the way he joked around and stuff, until I got to know him a lot better. And then, and he was obviously hilarious. He's known for his personality. So it was just funny for me, because as a 17-year-old girl getting to know this guy, my perception was totally off in the beginning, because I just didn't get that kind of humor or that personality. And I had to take a step back and be like, oh, that is actually pretty hilarious. I just never knew somebody that well that had that sort of personality. So that was me kind of taking a step back and being like, oh, my lived experience doesn't inform me well enough to understand this personality. Let me figure out some more, right? Let me peel back the layers of self-disclosure, think about the window, right? What you want people to know about you, what you want to tell people about yourself. That's absolutely comes into play when it comes to stuff like this. So let's talk about what we are looking for when we are trying to indicate whether people are being accurate with their nonverbal messages. So what we do is we look for expressions. We look for things that tell things about nonverbal behavior, right? And these expressions help indicate what is happening with somebody's underlying emotion. So there's a theory that the book talks about called emotional contagion theory. And that is that we can actually catch the emotions of other people based on their nonverbal messaging. And one of the best examples that I can give you of this is crying. So you have somebody telling you a story. Their nonverbal behavior starts with emotion that is so overwhelming that they start to cry. A lot of times, people will start to tear up or cry because somebody else is doing that as well. Somebody else's nonverbal behavior is so emotional that it actually catches on, right? Emotional contagion theory says you can actually catch the emotion of somebody else. Opposite of that, think about laughing, right? Think about when somebody tells something that is so funny that you laugh, that you actually start feeling the joy and excitement from somebody else just because their emotions are so contagious. The second one, and kind of complete opposite of the spectrum, is cues that we can tell that somebody's lying. We actually can tell that a lot by the way somebody's acting, the way they shift their body language, the way they become very uncomfortable, the way they kind of shift their clothes, they shift their hands, they move around a lot. That absolutely can tell if somebody's lying. I actually do I'm sorry I can't do this with you guys, but I actually do something in class where I have a volunteer come up and they actually say 2 things that are truthful and 2 things that are not truthful in front of the entire class. And then I try to pick out the things that are not truthful. And the way in which I do this is I watch their behavior and I try to see if they move their body a certain way only during 2 times. So during the 2 lies, if they make some sort of body movement only during 2 statements, I know that those 2 are the ones that are the lie. It's actually a very interesting concept and idea. And I've watched several videos in my grad program about nonverbal communication. I took an entire class on nonverbal communication, and that's where we learn to pick up on cues for people that are lying. So it's actually very interesting. I'm sorry we can't do that face-to-face as a class. So think about limitations to verbal communication, right? We know that sometimes people can manipulate them. Sometimes they become very ambiguous because we don't understand them and we have a hard time reading them. So those are things that we have to account for. They can have different meanings for different people. They can be very continuous, right? They have a hard time sometimes having a beginning and an end, like a verbal message has a beginning and an end. Sometimes nonverbal just kind of keeps rolling, right? And those sometimes become hard. A lot of times they happen in multiple ways. So we have multi-channeled messages coming towards us. We have body language, we have facial expressions, we have emotion in our eyes, we have eye contact, we have people changing the way in their posture and their clothes and adjusting, things like that. So that's multi-channeled, and of course it is culturally based, right? We learn sometimes our nonverbal messaging from influences of our culture, of our lived experiences. So a lot of times we can experience things that we don't understand because we've just never been exposed to it before, right? And then that's how we have this other oriented worldview of people, by learning those things. But initially they might be different for us because we just don't understand it. We've never been exposed to it before. And it's actually a very interesting thing to think about because we learn the way in which other people communicate that way by reading their verbal and their nonverbal messaging. So, ways in which we can improve our own nonverbal skills, right? The first thing we can do is be mindful of things, right? Remember, we talked about how self-awareness and what's going on around us and what's going on in our head is absolutely important. Nonverbal skills is no different, right? We want to be mindful of what's going on. We want to observe the things that we are seeing. We want to make sure that we're assigning it accurate meaning. We want to make sure that we are asking other people for feedback. We are asking other people for how they thought about situations. Have you interacted with this person? Have you seen them act that way before? Is that something they do all the time? Was the way I presented myself to be really good? I used to do this in public speaking early on in my career. I wanted people to give me feedback on my nonverbal behaviors while I was speaking for my profession because I wanted to maintain a very professional demeanor about myself. But that only comes with feedback from other people, right? I don't want to be flying my hands around and make sure that I'm presenting myself the way I want my nonverbal behaviors to be. The last one is practicing, right? Practice makes perfect, so we want to make sure that we are exhibiting good nonverbal skills that way. So this ends our 3-part lecture series on nonverbal communication. There are some example videos that I'm going to have posted. Please watch them. I think it'd be great for you to see some things that we talked about.